You're welcome. It's a great honor and pleasure to have you here at the baptism site. Before we start and talk about the importance of our site, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the history of the rediscovery of the site. In 1995, His Royal Highness Prince Ghazi, the head of the Board of Trustees of the Baptism Site Commission, was at the baptism site accompanied by the late Father Piccirillo of the Franciscan Church. Depending on many documents, the late Father Piccirillo thought that this was the site where very important biblical events took place. So therefore, he took His Highness Prince Ghazi to Elijah's Hill, and then they went toward the River Jordan, close to the place where Jesus was baptized. In 1995, we still had minefields in the area. So they basically risked their lives walking in the wilderness, but they knew they were looking for something ever so important. We know that in 1994, Jordan signed the peace treaty with Israel. So therefore, having visited the site, His Highness and the late Father Piccirillo, orders were given to demine the area. And in 1997, a team from the Department of Antiquities of Jordan were at the site to test trenches and surveys searching for important archaeological remains. A lot of archaeological discoveries were made, but then we started to think about something even more important. We wanted to answer a question: where was Jesus baptized? Now, to answer a question as important and delicate as this, we needed to have many sources. So we depended on 5 major sources to tell us this is the authentic site where John started his ministry and Christianity basically started. The 2 main sources we start on, we can talk on right here at this room, depending on a copy of the mosaic map of the Holy Land. The 2 references I'm going to talk about are basically the Gospel, the Bible, and the mosaic map of the Holy Land. This is a copy of the mosaic map. The original one is located in St. George Church in Madaba, and this mosaic map is priceless because it has over 150 sites that are mentioned in the Bible depicted on. By the way, the original map is huge. On the map, we arrive at the southern parts of Lebanon, Syria, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, Palestine, Israel, and Egypt. All of this area was part of the Holy Land. But here, when we zoom in to our geographical area, we note many landmarks. We see the southern part of the River Jordan, the northern part of the Dead Sea, Jericho, Galgala, fish meeting at this point of the Jordan, Betabara. All of this is in Old Greek, by the way. We are located, geographically speaking, east of the Jordan, opposite Jericho, right here. The site in Old Greek had 2 names, Ainun and then Safsafas. Now, Ainun is the plural of Ain in Aramaic, which is spring. A spring we're going to refer to later on, the spring where John started baptizing the believers. Now, Safsafas is the tamarisk trees that are in the catchment area of the River Jordan on either bank of it. Let's talk, depending on the Bible, about important events that took place here on either side of the Jordan. We know that after the death of Moses in the area of Mount Nebo, around 25 kilometers east of our geographic location, Joshua chapters 1 to 5 tell us how Joshua crosses the river with the 12 tribes of Israel toward Jericho. And the story continues. But in 2 Kings chapter 2, we have a very important reference about Elijah and Elisha. Elijah, the Tishbite, who was born near Ajlon in an area called Listib nowadays, at the last day of his life, was guided to cross over the Jordan from the west toward the east. What the Bible tells us in 2 Kings chapter 2 is the following. Elijah and his disciple Elisha come from Gilgal toward Jericho. When they arrive at the Jordan, Elijah just strikes the mantle to the Jordan, and it splits. They walk on dry ground to the east, and there's a whirlwind that takes Elijah up to heaven in a chariot and horses of fire. Elijah's mantle drops. Elisha receives it. In other words, he receives the prophecy. He goes back to the Jordan, he strikes it again, and it splits once again, and he continues his journey toward Jericho, and the story continues. What's interesting is the very last words of the Old Testament that tell us that Elijah will be sent once again. Full stop. The end of the Old Testament. In the New Testament, we have many examples, such as Luke chapter 1, verse 17, where we're told that John came in the spirit and strength of Elijah. So where does he come? He comes to the place from where Elijah's taken up to heaven, lives in a simple cave, baptizing the believers, waiting for the arrival of Jesus. In John chapter 1, verse 18 to 28, we know that John lived in the wilderness. That's what the Bible tells us. But we have other references telling us where Jesus was baptized. I think it's best to talk about those references at the sites we're going to visit very soon. But before we end up talking about the mosaic map, I'd like to talk about a couple of other things that are important the Madaba citizens left us with. The two fish that we see at this point of the Jordan. Now, fish come from the Galilee, the Tiberias, go to the Dead Sea where nothing lives. So therefore it comes back up north. But don't we also know that fish was the secret sign of Christianity or symbol of Christianity? So when we have the two fish meet at this point of the Jordan, it's because John met Jesus and baptized him and Christianity physically started. We know in Old Greek, fish is Ichthus, the 5 letters of which being Jesus Christ, God's Son, Savior. So we even note two fish at many apses of Byzantine churches in Jordan and elsewhere. Talking about the wilderness that we have mentioned in John chapter 1, we see animals depicted here too. East of the Jordan, opposite Jericho, in the Perea. That's what the site, or the area rather, was called in the Roman period, the Perea. We see a deer being chased by a lion. I think personally that reminds us of Matthew chapter 14. The deer, the good, the righteous, John the Baptist, is followed by Herod the Tetrarch, the lion, the king of the Perea. Because at the end of the day, John, having baptized Jesus, according to John chapter 3, verse 23, he goes to Ainun near to Salim because there was abundance of water there, and then he was captured by the soldiers of Herod the Tetrarch, and on his birthday, when Salome danced the famous dance, John was beheaded. So basically, we see the lion chasing a deer, what we have in Matthew chapter 14. These landmarks are great. The priceless map that we're left with was among the most important sources, plus the Bible. Now, regarding the other sources, I think it's best to go out to the wilderness and see how all our sources put together give us the answer of Bethany beyond Jordan being the authentic site where John started his ministry. Very important biblical events took place, and eventually Jesus was baptized, the Trinity met, and Christianity physically started, according to John chapter 1, verse 28. So, ahlan wa sahlan, you're welcome to Bethany beyond Jordan, a World Heritage Site. Before I start to talk about the important events that took place at Elijah's Hill, I'd like to remind ourselves about important events that took place here in the millennium. To start with, at the celebrations of Arbor Day, Their Majesties King Abdullah II and Queen Rania decided to plant palm trees only 500 meters to the east from where we are. And right after that, we had heads of churches start to come and visit the site to know about the important biblical events that took place here. The next day, on the 17th of January 2000, Catholicos Karakin II, the head of the Armenian church in the world, was at the site holding a mass on Elijah's Hill with the presence of around 500 Armenians. And then I had the honor to accompany him to explain about the site, specifically arriving to the place where John met Jesus, baptized him, and then the River Jordan. On the 20th of March 2000, His late Holiness Pope John Paul II was received at the Royal Hashemite Court by their Majesties, and on the 20th he went to Mount Nebo, His late Holiness, where Moses had his last look to the Holy Land and Gilad. But the next day, 21st of March, His Holiness was here with the presence of around 15,000 from the Catholic Church. He held the Mass under the remains of this church we see to our right. What he did had a very important message actually, because His Holiness Pope Mobile parked right here, and His Holiness with his accompanying delegation walked toward the church, where he stood under the arch and he blessed the west bank from where we are. Then turning 180 degrees to the east, we have Mount Nebo where Moses died. So therefore, he blessed the eastern bank of the Holy Land. In other words, the message behind this is that this is a very important and integral part of the Holy Land. Indeed, His Majesty King Abdullah calls the site the heart of the Holy Land. We are at this point 3 kilometers east of the River Jordan, 10 kilometers north of the Dead Sea. Jericho can be seen at the foot of the mountain 13 kilometers away. Therefore, we do remember, according to 2 Kings chapter 2, how Elijah started off from Jericho, miraculously crossing the Jordan, walking together to the east, when there was a whirlwind that took Elijah up to heaven. Elijah received the mantle and went back, miraculously crossing the Jordan once again, arriving to Jericho, and the story continued. We know that Elijah was to come again, but then Luke chapter 1 verse 17 was clear. John came in spirit and strength. So he lived under the shade of Elijah in a simple cave we're going to see in a minute. He lived in a cave baptizing the believers in the spring that encircles Elijah's hill, baptizing the believers. That's when is asked, according to John chapter 1 verse 18 to 28, are you Elijah? Are you the Messiah? That's when he said, I'm a crying voice in the wilderness, preparing the way of the Lord. If we get closer, we see the remains of a monastery. We know in the Byzantine period, or rather before the Byzantine period, we had Christians in many places, specifically in this area of the Holy Land. So they built a prayer hall to start with before Christianity was official in the 4th century, before Saint Helena became a Christian and her son Emperor Constantine ordered churches to be built in many important sites for Christians, such as the Church of Nativity, the Holy Sepulchre, and we know a church was to be built at Bethany beyond the Jordan, where Jesus was baptized and Christianity physically started. We get closer to see the other remains, and we note a cistern is discovered right here to collect water. This cistern that took around 100 cubic meters of water was not enough for those who lived in the monastery, according to Epiphanius, for example, the pilgrim in the 8th century. We know that 6 monks lived in this monastery, and pilgrims were using or walking across this site, coming all the way from Jerusalem toward Jericho, crossing over to Bethany beyond Jordan, arriving to Mount Nebo. Some of them even continued to Macarius, where John was beheaded, and Mount Sinai, where Moses received the prophecy, the 10 commandments rather. Now, we do know that a well was built, and once the cistern was filled, then they had to fill a well too. This indicates that the number of pilgrims was increasing. We do also know by many pilgrims who have visited the site throughout history that tens of thousands of pilgrims used to come here to be baptized. The pilgrims did need water. We did discover flasks at the site too. So we can imagine those who filled their flasks from here to continue their pilgrimage walking toward Mount Nebo and elsewhere. By the way, we ask ourselves a question: why did they need to build a cistern and well, places to collect fresh water, where they had the spring that they could use? Antoninus from Picenza, one of the pilgrims in the 6th century, to be accurate in the year 570, mentioned the spring and the cave where John lived. And he said, it arrives to the river Jordan only in rainy season. So in harsh summer periods here, around 320 meters below sea level, we know it becomes very, very hot. So therefore they needed their reservoirs of water to keep going in the harsh summer periods. If we get closer toward the hill, before we talk about the important events that took place here, let us read the Bible a little more carefully, specifically in Matthew chapter 11, verses 7 and 8, where Jesus asks a question to the crowd. He asks, what are you going to the wilderness to see? A reed being shaken by wind, or a man dressed in silk gown? And Jesus asked the question, saying that those who wear silk gowns live in palaces. And we know in Matthew chapter 3, verse 4, that John dressed in camel skin, eating wild honey and locusts. I mention these verses because we know the site is very similar to what Jesus saw. The small bushes we see surrounding Elijah's hill, that are called yambut in Arabic, happen to be the natural habitat for bees. The Latin name is Prosopis facta. So it produces wild white honey in the summer and spring. So therefore, knowing that John lived in a simple cave here, we know he ate wild honey and locust, and the reeds are still there. I'm so proud that the Royal Commission, ever since it was established, have preserved the site the way John and Jesus saw. This is because we want people to experience what John and Jesus did, to walk in their trails and to live the words of the Gospels. Let's get closer and see the cave where John lived. I'm standing over the remains of the foundations of a wall that was built by the Byzantines to encircle and protect the inner parts of the monastery right here. That was called the Rhetorius Monastery. Why do I stand right here? Because this cave in particular is of great importance to mankind. We have two documents to tell us St. John the Baptist himself lived in this simple cave, eating wild honey and locust, baptizing the believers next to the spring where we have reeds right now. One of the documents is by Antoninus the pilgrim from Picenza, who carefully mentioned and described the cave, saying John lived here, and adding that a church is built around it. He even described the canal of water that we see right here. But there's another document that patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church at the times of Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab left us a document with. We know there was a priest who asked a 1-year vacation from his bishop to follow the trails of the prophets. John himself started off from Jerusalem to the west, crossed the Jordan, and he came and lived in this cave. Upon arrival to the cave, he got struck with fever. He was very sad because he couldn't continue his journey following the trails of the prophets. Somebody appears to him that night telling him, I will heal you. Don't worry. You will be able to continue your journey if you wish. He didn't know who appeared to him in this vision, so he didn't give an answer. That's the priest John I'm talking about, of course. But then the next night, John the priest is staying here. He has high fever, and then a vision is seen by him. Again, the same sentence is said. Don't worry, I can heal you, and you will be able to continue and do what you like. But then the priest John asks, who are you to tell you all this? And he says, I'm John the Baptist, adding that Jesus quite often visited John in this cave. The priest John believed in that, and he was instantly healed and ordered the church to be built around it. What we see right here is the natural cave that happens to be an integral part of a Byzantine church. The circular or semicircular apse with niches, and we see in the northern area the remains of the foundations of the art system over which the church roof was built. We even have remains of some mosaic tessera, beautiful tessera, that covered the floor of this church. So we know that churches are not built around the cave unless there's a big and important story. We know now that St. John the Baptist lived in this simple cave, as I said, baptizing the believers right here in this holy valley that in the mosaic map had two names, Ainun, now Safsafas. Now Ainun is where the spring runs that Antoninus from Pachanta called John the Baptist Spring. So we can physically go back 2,000 years more or less from now and imagine what took place at this holy area. It's right here where Elijah is taken up to heaven in chariot and horse of fire. It's right here where Elisha received the prophecy, and it's right here, this cave where John started his ministry, and this physically is the wilderness of John the Baptist described in John chapter 1. If we walk along the northern part of the monastery walls, we see the remains of the area where the monks lived. And over here we see the remains of a beautifully preserved mosaic floor of a church. Now in that church we see in the nave area the cracks that were formed by earthquakes that kept destroying churches built in the area. In the apse area we note something very important. A Greek inscription that is translated as follows: by the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, this whole monastery was built by the God-loving monk and presbyter Rhetorius. May God grant him mercy. So we know it was the monk Rhetorius who ordered this monastery to be built in the Byzantine period, and today we have tried to preserve it, keeping it the way we discovered it. The only physical intervention we had was to build a shelter that is reversible, and it goes along international charters of preservation of heritage. So therefore the site is preserved in a simple and beautiful way. We have drawings of the area in the Roman period when it was just a simple hill with a cave and the spring running next to it. In the Byzantine period we can imagine the monastery walls and the churches that were built here. Moreover, the baptism pools that we have in the top area of the hill, and then we have a drawing of the site the way it is, because it would be falsification if we rebuild the monastery as it was in the Byzantine period. Standing right here, let's imagine John the Baptist Spring running over, arriving to the River Jordan at a distance of 3 kilometers to the west. We have discovered around this holy valley many hermit cells and caves where the hermits stayed after John abandoned the area, having baptized Jesus. Going across it, or around the spring, about halfway between here and the River Jordan, both a caravanserai or pilgrim station and a huge baptism pool were discovered. At the end, where the spring met the River Jordan in the past, that's where John met Jesus and baptized him. What I'm trying to say right here is that there's a physical and spiritual link between these two areas, where John came and started his ministry and where he met Jesus, and after the small argument baptized him and Christianity started. Here at this spot, we view the remains of a pilgrimage station, a caravanserai. That reminds us of important issues. Yes, the remains are minimal, the foundation level only, and some remains in the northeastern part of the wall of the caravanserai. But it reminds us of something ever so important, that pilgrims coming all the way from Jerusalem, crossing over to Bethlehem and the Jordan, sometimes rested here, stayed overnight to continue their pilgrimage, arriving eventually at Mount Nebo and elsewhere. These remains tell us a big story about pilgrims starting from as early as Christianity started, and it continues today. When they stayed here, we know there was a big pool where they could be baptized at the times when the river was in flood. Now, if we go have a view at that, we'll see what our ancestors did, reusing or using rather the waters of the spring of John through an open canal to fill the huge pool where tens or maybe hundreds of pilgrims could be baptized at the same time. The Baptism Site Commission has dedicated 2 specific zones to build new churches at the area. This was after letters of authentications that were sent to the Royal Commission saying this is one of the holiest free sites for Christians on earth. Indeed, some of them, like Patriarch Alexei II of the Russian Orthodox Church, said this is the holiest Christian site on earth. Now we see in the background, close to the catchment area of the Jordan, just east of the Jordan, the Greek Orthodox monastery that's called St. John the Baptist Monastery. Further behind, we see the 2 bell towers and the Latin church under construction. We also see the gold dome, the onion-shaped dome that belongs to the Russian church and Russian pilgrimage house. Now, turning around toward the east, over there, we see what's named the Shrine of the 5 Prophets, who were right here. We've talked about earlier on. Joshua, Elijah, Elisha, John, and Jesus. We dedicated another zone to build other churches. We have the Lutheran church over there. Then we have the Armenian Orthodox Church and the Coptic Church under construction. Other churches have applied to build their new churches in the area, but we're waiting for the World Heritage Center approval because we have to hand over an heritage impact assessment and environmental impact assessment studies to make sure that the outstanding universal value of the site is preserved. At this point, we arrive and see the spring that was mentioned by Antoninus from Piacenza and others such as Daniel from Russia in the 12th century. The spring that starts next to John the Baptist's cave runs here at the lower part, and people can follow the spring to lead them at one of the most important discoveries at the site, the remains of 5 churches that are built in memory of a great event that took place at the site. I'm going to leave it for later on to talk about because that's a gem of gems. Having followed John the Baptist spring, we arrived what I called earlier the gem of gems. Right here, we need to remember 2 things before we start and talk about the important event that took place. First of all, we know through our scientific source that the river surrounded these remains, but then during history it meandered away. That's why it's around 150 meters away from the point we are. But then we need to remember another important thing. John the Baptist is living east of the Jordan opposite Jericho. He's right here at this point. When Jesus arrives with other people to be baptized by John, upon arrival, Jesus asks to be baptized by John. Now John hesitates and says, "Who am I? I'm not worthy to untie his shoelaces. But then, to fulfill righteousness, John consented and baptized Jesus right here at this point. Quoting to John chapter 1, verse 18 onwards, very important events took place right here. The baptism of Jesus, the moment he comes out of the water, the Holy Spirit descends in the shape of a dove, and the voice of the Lord announces, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." Of course, Jesus was baptized, but the next day he comes over again to Bethany beyond the Jordan, or Betabara beyond the Jordan, depending on the edition of the Bible you're reading. But then he accompanies the two brothers who were prepared by John, Andrew and Simon, whom he calls Peter, the rock over which Christianity would be built, and accompanies them to start his ministry. So the baptism of Jesus is the beginning of his ministry at the age of 30. That's why we believe this is the spot where John baptized Jesus and Christianity physically started. At this point, of course, from the Byzantine period, our ancestors tried to build a church, one church after the other. The first church they built was called the Church of St. John the Baptist. According to the description of Theodosius in the late 6th century, the church was built high on chambers on account of river went overflows. The architects and engineers did not consider earthquakes, but we do know the Jordan Valley Rift is an earthquake zone. So therefore, the first church built in memory of the baptism of Jesus was destroyed because of earthquakes. Do they give up? Never. Antoninus, who described the cave where John lived, the spring where he baptized the believers, describes steps that led to the bank of the Jordan where the Lord was baptized. Arculf, the French pilgrim in the 7th century, left us with great testimonies. He said, if a tall man goes down the steps, the water of the Jordan would arrive to his chest in summer. It would cover his head in winter. But he added, in times of big floods of the Jordan, it would totally immerse the mantle chapel that is uninhabitable, being built on 4 piers. This design was truly unique and special. When you have a church, a memorial built on 4 piers, what would the shape of water be between it? It's a cross. How were baptistries built in the Byzantine period? They were cruciform. So it makes this the one and only cruciform baptistry that used the water of the Holy Jordan for pilgrims to be baptized in. Now at the lower parts of the northern piers, we see remains of the plaster, original plaster, where we have thousands of cross marks left by pilgrims who were baptized at this point. Now this second church was destroyed because of earthquakes too. Engineers decide to build a new basilica, this time on the ground level, strengthening the foundations. They built a basilica that was destroyed because of floods of the Jordan now. In the 8th century, they built a second one over the remains of the earlier basilica. This was described by 2 pilgrims in the 8th century, Epiphanius and Saint Willibald from Germany. Those 2 basilicas were destroyed because of floods, as I said earlier. Later on, at the beginning of the 12th century, to be precise, in 1106, 1107, Daniel, the abbot from Russia, describes a small chapel with a small apse that marked the place where our Lord was baptized. At this point, we note one thing that's ever so important. We see how our ancestors insisted and challenged the forces of nature to build one church after the other in a place we don't have a community to serve, in the middle of this wilderness. Why did they build their churches right here and the unique cruciform baptistry? Depending on the Bible, depending on the pilgrims' accounts, depending on the archaeological discoveries and the mosaic map of the Holy Land, because this is where Jesus baptized and Christianity physically started. I call these churches to be the lowest churches discovered on earth on the catchment area of the Jordan. At this point, we're about 385 meters below sea level, but yet it's the closest to heaven. Jordan is heaven on earth. Now, I want to add a couple of things. This site that belongs to all of you is such a very important site, as we've noted, being the place where Jesus was baptized and Christianity physically started. But then we have great messages that mankind needs very badly, specifically nowadays. Knowing that at least 3 of these churches were built in Islamic period, from Umayyad up to Ayyubi Mamluki, and the modern churches that are built today in the Hashemite period, we know churches were built in Islamic periods. This is how we live in the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. Our constitution gives us equal rights as Christians or Muslims. We do have rights and we have duties, but this is a great example telling and trying to offer a message to mankind. Let us build human bridges of love and peace. Let's not forget a message that was suggested by His Majesty King Abdullah in the year 2010. His Majesty suggested that we have interfaith harmony in the United Nations, and it was unanimously adopted. We each year, starting the year 2011, celebrate the first week of February interfaith harmony, knowing and believing that human beings need to join hands together and make this world a better place to live on. Of course, at the end of the visit, having seen all the archaeological remains and the big stories that took place here, we have a place where people can baptize their children, a small baptismal font that tells the story, John baptizing Jesus, the Holy Spirit descending, and Christianity physically starting. But then others prefer to be baptized in the river itself. Let's have a look at the River Jordan, that, by the way, is part of the name of our Hashemite kingdom, the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. This is the river that ran through history and reminds us of important biblical events, prophets and messengers crossing either from the east to the west of the Jordan or the other way back. What I'm trying to say is that there were no borders. Prophets and messengers freely crossed on either side of the Jordan, leaving us with the important memories and messages we have in the various Gospels. At this point, seeing the chapel that we see in the West Bank right now, actually that marks the spot where His late Majesty King Hussein welcomed the first Pope out of the Vatican to this part of the Holy Land, His late Holiness Pope Paul VI. But after the recent opening of our site, 3 popes from the Vatican have visited the site. His late Holiness Pope John Paul II, His Holiness Pope Benedict XVI, and the last one was His Holiness Pope Francis. But other popes from other churches and denominations were here too. From the Coptic Church, for example, we had the late Pope Shenouda, and then we had Pope Tawadros II, and heads of churches from the Greek Orthodox Church and the various Orthodox Church were here too, because this is a spot where Christianity started, and that's why all Christians meet at this point to get closer to what we have in the Gospels. To basically, we call it the 5th Gospel. You just see what you've read in the 4 Gospels. So you're most welcome to enjoy this heritage that belongs to all of you. At this point, it's important, I think, to remember His late Majesty King Hussein, who taught us a lot of things. His Majesty was our king, was our father, and we've learned so much from His Majesty. Among the things we've learned is that heritage belongs to mankind. Indeed, we respect everything we've learned from His late Majesty, and here we wanted to remind everybody who visits our site about how we in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan do take care of our heritage, respect it, and preserve it for you to enjoy the best way. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'll be very honest with you. Whatever I said, whatever you have seen is not enough. If you don't physically come and walk in the trails of John and Jesus, you wouldn't experience what we would like you to experience. So I welcome you. The Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan welcomes you to this part of the Holy Land.